Why peace in Ethiopia remains ever elusive. Ethiopia's struggle for peace. Ethiopia's quest for peace remains hindered by deep-rooted historical and political challenges. Its unresolved past continues to stir conflict, with historical injustices and manipulation of power obstructing meaningful reconciliation. The legacy of colonial subjugation and domination has bred resentment and mistrust, perpetuating division rather than unity. Ethiopia's narrative of supposed national unity often overlooks the colonization, marginalization, and suffering endured by various groups, leaving critical issues unaddressed. To foster genuine peace, Ethiopia must confront these historical grievances head-on. Ethiopia's future existence as a unit and its stability depends on acknowledging the pain of its past and pursuing truth and reconciliation. While the path forward is fraught with challenges, addressing the structural inequalities and the long-standing marginalization of national groups, such as the Oromo, is essential. Lasting peace will only be achievable through substantial reforms that dismantle its colonial legacy and political manipulation of peace as a mere tool for control. Ethiopia's imperial legacy must be critically examined and corrected, as the failure to address these deeper political and historical realities ensures that peace will remain out of reach. Understanding Ethiopia's present challenges requires a thorough exploration of its turbulent past and a commitment to structural change. The colonial foundations of Ethiopia. Ethiopia's formation as a colonial empire under Emperor Menelik II in the late 19th century involved the violent conquest and forced annexation of nations such as Oromiyaa, Sidama, and Somali. These campaigns resulted in significant atrocities, including the massacres at Chilenko in 1887 and Anole in 1886, where thousands were killed, and brutal mutilations were inflicted to terrorize the Oromo and other groups into submission. After the conquest, Ethiopia imposed policies aimed at erasing the cultural, economic, and political identities of the subjugated nations. Baxter, in his 1978 article titled "Ethiopia's Unacknowledged Problem, the Oromo," argues that
though Oromo was denied any official status, and it was not permissible to publish, preach, teach, or broadcast in Oromo, in court or before an official, an Oromo had to speak Amharic or use an interpreter. Even a case between Oromos before an Oromo-speaking magistrate had to be heard in Amharic. I sat through a mission service at which the preacher and all the congregation were Oromo, but at which the sermon as well as the service was given first in Amharic, which few of the congregation understood at all, and then translated into Oromo. The farce had to be played out in case a Judas informed, and the district officer fined or imprisoned the preacher.
The Oromo's Gadaa system, a sophisticated democratic governance structure, was sidelined in favor of imperial rule. Oromo lands were confiscated and redistributed to Amhara Tigray settlers, churches, and military officials, undermining the economic base and eroding the cultural autonomy of the Oromo people. As Hussein highlights in his 2008 article titled "The Politics of Language, Power, and Pedagogy in Ethiopia," addressing the past and present conditions of the Oromo language.
Following Menelik II's conquest of Oromo land, the Oromo were forced to relinquish their land and pay tribute to the conquerors. They were also made to relinquish their religious, cultural, linguistic, and political identities. The conquerors created hegemonic structures through which they would perpetuate their cultural, economic, and political domination.
Despite some modernizations and reforms, Ethiopia's status as a colonial empire remains largely unchanged. The myth of a unified ancient Ethiopia, claimed to be over 3,000 years old and rooted in the Solomonic dynasty, serves to legitimize the dominance of Amhara and Tigrayan elites while erasing the histories of nations like the Oromo, whose cultural heritage predates Ethiopia's imperial formation. This myth fuels continued instability by denying the rights and recognition of these colonized nations. Economic and social marginalization. Successive Ethiopian regimes disproportionately favored settler communities in economic and social development, while indigenous populations were denied access to education and economic opportunities. Schools, healthcare centers, and infrastructure were primarily built to benefit settlers, leaving colonized nations underdeveloped and further entrenching divisions. Education for the children of marginalized groups was particularly limited, with schools concentrated in settler-dominated garrison towns. Even when indigenous children gained access, language barriers hindered their progress, as fluency in Amharic was required to advance through the educational system. Afaan Oromo, the language of the Oromo people, was denied official status, and its use in publications, education, and broadcasts was prohibited. This exclusion from economic and educational opportunities cemented the deep divisions in Ethiopian society. The economic marginalization extended beyond education. Indigenous communities faced systemic barriers to economic participation, with land and resources often confiscated and redistributed to settlers. This not only disrupted traditional livelihoods, but also entrenched economic disparities that persist to this day. The social fabric of these communities was deliberately weakened, as traditional governance structures and cultural practices were suppressed. The cumulative effect of these policies was to create a deeply stratified society, where the benefits of development were unequally distributed, fueling resentment and unrest. The legacy of economic and social marginalization continues to impact Ethiopia's path to peace and stability. Addressing these historical injustices is crucial for building a more inclusive and equitable society. To foster genuine reconciliation and achieve sustainable development, we must first understand the root causes of these disparities and address them equitably. Political marginalization and conflict. Following the conquest, the Oromo and other occupied peoples were systematically excluded from political participation. Oromo leaders were imprisoned, mutilated, or killed, and Oromo culture, traditions, and language were banned from official use. The political and military institutions of Ethiopia were dominated by Amhara and Tigrayan elites, relegating the Oromo and other subjugated peoples to poverty and serfdom. Successive Ethiopian regimes sought to modernize the empire by building some infrastructure and introducing modern education, mainly to benefit the settler communities. However, they consistently failed to address the systems of inequality they had established. The ruling elites resisted genuine democratization, fearing the loss of privileges they had gained through conquest. The Oromo Liberation Front, OLF, in collaboration with other national groups, ensured that the 1991 Transitional Charter stipulated federalism in the planned constitution. Under the EPRDF government led by Meles Zenawi, federalism was introduced as a potential solution to inter-nation tensions. Despite the promise of autonomy through an ethno-linguistic federal system, genuine political inclusion never materialized. The federal arrangement instead deepened identity-based divisions and became a tool for controlling dissent. The system was designed to centralize power in the hands of the ruling elite, particularly Zenawi's inner circle. Although the Constitution enshrined self-determination, in practice, ethno-linguistic federalism was weaponized to deepen identity-based divisions, creating a structure that marginalized groups like the Oromo. Ethno-linguistic federalism, despite its theoretical promise of self-rule, its ill implementation entrenched central control over resources, contributing to political exclusion and frustration among non-Amhara and non-Tigrayan groups. This political marginalization has been a significant driver of conflict in Ethiopia, with marginalized communities continuing to fight for their rights and recognition. Understanding these dynamics is essential for any efforts towards lasting peace and stability. Lessons learned from the Tigray War. The Tigray War, which began in 2020, serves as a crucial example of the Ethiopian regime's approach to peace. Following the invitation extended to the Eritrean army to intervene in the conflict, reports surfaced of widespread atrocities, including looting, killings, and severe human rights violations. Despite the Pretoria Agreement in 2022 that successfully silenced the guns, the Ethiopian regime has failed to remove Eritrean forces from Tigray, raising concerns about its genuine commitment to peace. Recent reports indicate that Eritrean forces have taken control of key border towns, further reinforcing the opposition's belief that the Ethiopian regime does not aim for true reconciliation, but instead uses external forces to maintain control and exert pressure. This deepens the distrust between the Ethiopian regime and marginalized groups such as the Oromo, who have endured decades of political marginalization, violence, and suppression. The Ethiopian government's alignment with foreign forces, particularly Eritrean troops, in invading Tigray in 2020 highlights the challenges in establishing peace. Nearly 2 years after the Pretoria Peace Agreement in November 2022, the government's unwillingness or inability to drive out Eritrean forces and secure Tigrayan territory underscores the persistent mistrust many Ethiopian nations feel toward the central government. This experience, coupled with the historical marginalization of various nations within Ethiopia, strengthens the argument that these nations cannot rely on the Ethiopian government to ensure their security. Consequently, any disarmament and demobilization efforts will likely be unacceptable unless these nations are allowed to establish their own security forces. Given the long-standing and ongoing experiences of betrayal by the Ethiopian state, any peace process that undermines the autonomy of regional forces is bound to fail. The weaponization of peace in Ethiopia. Throughout Ethiopian history, peace has been weaponized as a tool to entrap and eliminate political opponents rather than foster genuine reconciliation. This manipulation of peace processes has been a consistent feature in Ethiopian statecraft, used to suppress dissent, consolidate power, and undermine opposition. A prime example is the Gadaa War of 1887, where Ras Deresu ambushed and killed Ibishe Garba under the pretense of peace talks, illustrating how peace has historically been employed to achieve military objectives. This same pattern has been repeated in more recent conflicts, including the Bali Oromo revolt, where peace agreements were violated almost as soon as they were signed, demonstrating the fragility of such accords in Ethiopia's conflict-ridden history. More recently, peace talks with the Oromo Liberation Army, OLA, in Zanzibar and Dar es Salaam in 2023 and 2024 have been similarly undermined. While these talks were supposed to represent a breakthrough in addressing the long-standing grievances of the Oromo people, military operations in Oromiyaa continued unabated, casting doubt on the sincerity of the government's intentions. This betrayal perpetuates a culture of distrust between the Ethiopian state and marginalized groups, particularly the Oromo, obstructing any genuine path to reconciliation. Ethiopian rulers have frequently framed peace negotiations as opportunities to consolidate power and suppress dissent. This tactic has consistently fostered a culture of distrust among marginalized groups, particularly the Oromo. The reliance on military force, even as peace talks are ongoing, demonstrates that control, rather than genuine peace building, remains the regime's priority. External actors such as Eritrea have also been involved in Ethiopia's military responses, further complicating peace efforts. The Eritrean government's involvement in Ethiopia's internal conflicts, especially in Tigray and Oromiyaa, signals a broader regional struggle for dominance and control, rather than any genuine interest in fostering peace and stability. As a result, peace talks have become yet another battlefield, where the Ethiopian government seeks to maintain its dominance rather than promote reconciliation. Historical injustices and unresolved conflicts. The persistence of historical injustices has compounded the challenges of peace building in Ethiopia. Atrocities like the massacres at Chelenko and Anoli, as well as the violent suppression of revolts in Beali and Raya Azebo, continue to shape the collective memory of resistance among marginalized groups, particularly the Oromo. These events are not merely footnotes in Ethiopian history. They are central to the ongoing grievances of the Oromo and other nation groups who have suffered under successive Ethiopian regimes. Despite the passage of time, the Ethiopian state has consistently refused to acknowledge these atrocities or offer reparations. Monuments such as the Anole Memorial serve as powerful reminders of these historical wrongs. Yet the Ethiopian government has done little to address the underlying grievances that persist. This refusal to confront and redress historical injustices fuels ongoing resentment and obstructs efforts at reconciliation. For the Oromo and other marginalized groups, the state's refusal to acknowledge their suffering perpetuates a sense of exclusion from the Ethiopian national narrative. The myth of a unified Ethiopia. Compounding these historical grievances is the enduring myth of a unified, ancient Ethiopia, often traced back to the Aksumite Empire and the Solomonic dynasty. This narrative has been employed to legitimize the political and cultural dominance of the Amhara and Tigrayan elites, while erasing the rich histories of other ethnic groups, especially the Oromo. The Oromo Gadaa system, a sophisticated model of democratic governance that predates Ethiopian imperialism, has been systematically excluded from the Ethiopian national narrative. This erasure is not merely symbolic. It represents the marginalization of Oromo political and cultural identity in the modern Ethiopian state. By promoting the myth of a unified Ethiopia, successive governments have sought to suppress ethnic diversity and resistance. The homogenizing narrative of Ethiopia as a singular, ancient entity has been used as a political tool to suppress dissent and legitimize the centralization of power. This has led to the alienation of various ethnic groups, particularly the Oromo, who feel excluded from the nation's political and cultural mainstream. The erasure of their histories and contributions has only deepened inter-nation resentments, obstructing any genuine possibility of reconciliation. The failure of peacemaking efforts. Efforts at peacemaking in Ethiopia have consistently failed due to the government's unwillingness to address the structural exclusion and historical grievances of its diverse ethnic groups. Negotiations with groups like the Oromo Liberation Front, OLF, and the Oromo Liberation Army, OLA, have been undermined by the regime's refusal to make meaningful concessions, revealing the government's preference for military solutions over dialogue. This approach has alienated the Oromo population, perpetuating instability and distrust. Even when peace agreements are reached, as in the case of the Pretoria Agreement following the Tigray conflict, they have failed to deliver sustainable peace due to Ethiopia government's agreement to the continued presence of foreign forces, such as Eritrean troops in the region. The Ethiopian government's reliance on military force, rather than dialogue, demonstrates its prioritization of control over peace. This strategy, while effective in the short term, has long-term consequences for the empire's stability. By refusing to address the root causes of identity-based grievances and historical injustices, the government ensures that peace will remain elusive. The ongoing military operations in Oromiyaa during the 2023 and 2024 peace talks exemplify this pattern, where peace negotiations are used as a smokescreen for continued violence and repression. The role of international actors. International actors, including the African Union, the European Union, and the United States, have played a complex and often contradictory role in Ethiopia's peace processes. These actors have, at various times, been instrumental in facilitating negotiations and ceasefires. However, their involvement has also, in some cases, exacerbated tensions within Ethiopia. International pressure is often applied unevenly, prioritizing the preservation of Ethiopia's territorial integrity and political survival over meaningful reforms that address the root causes of conflict. This approach tends to reinforce the status quo, failing to engage with the core grievances of marginalized groups such as the Oromo, Sidama, and Somali populations, who have long been excluded from political power. Instead of fostering a truly inclusive and equitable peace process, These interventions often result in flawed peace agreements that serve the interests of the Ethiopian state, but overlook the demands of peripheral communities. Such peace deals are typically characterized by a focus on security and stability at the expense of justice and reconciliation. As a result, they tend to perpetuate cycles of violence and instability, particularly in Ethiopia's peripheries, where ethnic and political grievances remain unaddressed. International actors, by prioritizing Ethiopia's strategic importance in the Horn of Africa, often neglect the deeper socio-political and historical dimensions of the conflict, further destabilizing the region, rather than bringing about sustainable peace. Attempt to resuscitate Imperial Ethiopia. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's rise to power in 2018 initially generated hope for political reform and stability in Ethiopia. His early achievements, particularly the peace agreement with Eritrea, were celebrated globally and earned him the Nobel Peace Prize in 2019. However, what was initially perceived as a historic peace deal later became evident as a strategic alliance that contributed to the devastating conflict in Tigray. Despite efforts at political reform and economic liberalization, these initiatives were overshadowed by escalating violence and a worsening humanitarian crisis. Abiy's tenure has been marked by rising tensions along national identity lines, exacerbated by his centralization of power. This centralization further marginalized the regions and nations such as the Oromo, who had fought for over 50 years for self-determination. Moreover, Abiy's government has faced widespread accusations of authoritarianism, including media censorship and the arrest of political opponents. The secretive Kori Naginya, a clandestine government squad allegedly operating with impunity under Abiy's direction, has further deepened societal divisions and contributed to Ethiopia's ongoing instability. Although the Oromo nation's relentless struggle played a pivotal role in bringing Abiy to power, he abandoned his party's promises for substantial reform by consolidating a highly centralized system of governance under the Prosperity Party. This worsened political marginalization, especially for the Oromo. The ongoing violence in Tigray, Oromiyaa, and the Amhara regions reflects the regime's reliance on military force rather than dialogue to address identity-based grievances. The establishment of the Prosperity Party and Abiy's consolidation of power have perpetuated the political exclusion of nation groups like the Oromo. The continued militarization of conflicts deepens mistrust and contributes to the ongoing instability in the region. Besides the deep mistrust between successive Ethiopian regimes and the various national movements, there is a sharp and probably irreparable divide between the national movements from historically marginalized nations, such as the Oromo, and those from the Amhara-Tigray elites. Incompatible Visions. The Ethiopian political landscape is divided by two incompatible visions for the future. These two ideals espouse mutually exclusive systems based on varying viewpoints: a pluralist view that champions a multinational federal system, and a unitarist view that promotes a centralized system. On the one hand, proponents of a multinational federation argue that Ethiopia is not one nation, but a collection of different nations, nationalities, and peoples. Since the creation of Ethiopia, these nations have been disenfranchised and repressed under the hegemony of the Amhara-Tigray elites. Proponents of federalism want to eliminate marginalization and build an equitable system that respects the group rights of Ethiopia's nations, nationalities, and peoples. These rights include demands to govern themselves through a representative democracy, to develop their respective cultures, languages, ways of life, and to respect minority rights. By contrast, proponents of the unitarist system, including Abiy Ahmed, are nostalgic for and espouse reinstating the imperial system that existed before the 1974 revolution. They envision a centralized and unitary state whereby the center dominates and determines the periphery's political, economic, and cultural policies. The tensions within Ethiopia's political system under Abiy mirror long-standing conflicts over national identity and governance, which date back to the 1960s student movement. At the forefront of this debate was Walalane Makonnen, who argued in his 1969 article on the question of nationalities in Ethiopia that Ethiopia was not one nation. He called for eliminating the marginalization of different nations and nationalities and supporting their struggle for self-determination. Three fundamental issues were central to the 1960s student movement: land to the tiller, equality and autonomy for nations and nationalities in Ethiopia, and the creation of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Why incompatible visions persist. The views that have led to this chasm in the Ethiopian political space are deeply ingrained in debates that have persisted since the students' movement of the 1960s. Makonan's call for addressing national inequalities has continued to resonate with Ethiopia's historically marginalized populations. Notwithstanding its repressive rule and half-hearted implementation of federalism, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, sought autonomy for Tigray and supported a multinational federation. Almost all independent and free national organizations of the historically marginalized nations in the Greater South who struggle for freedom, equality, justice, and democracy are proponents of the multinational federal system. The 1995 Constitution addresses the three fundamental issues. Rural and urban land are state property that shall not be subject to sale or other means of exchange. Every nation has an unconditional right to self-determination, including the right to secession, and every individual has the right to vote and be elected. Opposition parties beholden to the unitarist vision start their discussion from upholding the unity and survival of Ethiopia at any cost. For instance, recent discussions by opposition party representatives focused on lasting peace, national dialogue, transitional processes, and creating an umbrella organization for the many opposition parties. Some advocates argued that maintaining Ethiopia's unity and survival should be prioritized, even if it means succumbing to dictatorship, favoring an Amhara Tigray dictatorship over Abiy Ahmed's Prosperity Party. However, these opposition leaders do not seem concerned about the historically marginalized nations that have been struggling for over 50 years to rid themselves of Amhara Tigray hegemony. Any effort that does not take into consideration the sovereignty, collective, and individual rights of these nations is doomed to fail. A meaningful effort should start with addressing the root causes of these struggles. Only if these issues are resolved and with the consent of these nations can we begin to discuss Ethiopia's survival as a unified entity. The path forward. For Ethiopia to achieve sustainable peace, it must confront its colonial history and dismantle the legacies of past atrocities committed against the Oromo and other marginalized nations. This necessitates comprehensive political reforms aimed at acknowledging historical injustices and addressing identity-based marginalization across political, social, and economic spheres. Recognizing the sovereignty of various national groups, as enshrined in the 1995 Constitution, is essential. This includes acknowledging past wrongs and providing reparations to affected nations like the Oromo. Additionally, it is crucial to dismantle the entrenched narratives that uphold the hegemony of the Amhara Tigray tradition, fostering a pluralistic polity that respects and celebrates diversity, thus encouraging the participation of marginalized nations within the Federation. Efforts toward genuine peace must transcend mere subjugation. They should encompass land reforms, the opportunity for referendums enabling self-determination, legal protections for marginalized groups to establish their own security forces, and meaningful political representation. Opposition parties must also acknowledge the self-determination rights of all nations within the Ethiopian Empire, fostering an environment conducive to authentic coexistence. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's reluctance to engage in dialogue and compromise exacerbates Ethiopia's societal divisions. The opposition's pursuit of removing Abiy, only to replace him with another autocrat, risks deepening existing scars and hastening the empire's disintegration. The historical subjugation of Ethiopia's marginalized nations has created a profound divide, with the North imposing its culture and governance on the South, which has been denied the right to self-determination and govern through elected representatives. Despite significant progress achieved through decades of struggle, many goals remain unmet. Attempts to revert to a unitarist imperial system jeopardize Ethiopia's unity and accelerate the likelihood of disintegration. The potential breakup of Ethiopia can only be averted by permanently renouncing expansionist imperial ambitions. A comprehensive solution is essential for the preservation of Ethiopia as a unit. This includes initiating an inclusive dialogue facilitated by an independent and impartial body, free from preconceived agendas. For meaningful dialogue to occur, the Abiy administration must halt hostilities, release political prisoners, lift restrictions on political parties, including the terrorist designations against the Oromo Liberation Army, OLA, and permit genuine discourse. Establishing a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to address historical atrocities is vital for rebuilding trust and healing long-standing wounds. Unless these issues are confronted directly, Ethiopia will remain ensnared in a cycle of conflict, with true peace remaining elusive. The aspiration for self-governance by the people cannot be reversed. Efforts to do so only incite unnecessary bloodshed, destruction, and regional instability. However, such efforts will never thwart the nation's pursuit, as the arc of history inevitably bends toward freedom, justice, and equality. Why Peace in Ethiopia Remains Ever Elusive is produced and presented to you by BIRMADUU Media. Thank you for watching. Copyright BIRMADUU Media, September 2024.